Pinot Noir is one of the most reverently treated grapes in the entire world, and yet annoyingly passionate winemakers or wine lovers usually spend their time arguing over whether said legend of Pinot Noir is overestimated or deceptively underestimated. But very few of them ever stop to ask how it actually came to be so revered in the first place. I can say with less than a quantum of doubt that the whole overestimated, underestimated debate will never find conclusion, mostly because Pinot Noir really can be both. It produces one or two of the most sublime bottles of wine on the entire planet, but also delivers a veritable tsunami of insipid pallid slop. I'd go so far as to say that because the legend and divisive nature of Pinot Noir is so exaggerated that it results in 99.8% of all Pinot Noir in the world being horribly disappointing, purely because of the hype created by perhaps only 50 bottles on the entire planet produced each vintage. It's as though Pinot Noir wine, even when fairly delicious, is still a disappointment because it can never keep up with the legendary status that is perpetually being debated. And given that it is completely uncontroversial to assert that every one of these debates ends up in the region of Burgundy, where invariably Pinot fans will reference a few closed off-walled vineyards that only ever get tasted by a tiny minuscule fraction of the Earth's population, we can therefore deduce from that statistically speaking, the legend of Pinot has zero relevance to the vast majority of Pinot Noir drinkers. And therefore, the legend of Pinot Noir can surely not be found in the actual sensory experience of the average Pinot Noir drinker. So the question remains, where does the legend of Pinot come from for the vast majority of people who have never tasted Domaine de la Romanée-Conti and its kinfolk? Well, there is one theory that I think could hold some traction, and that's because it refers not to what's in the actual glass when you drink Pinot Noir, but rather a sort of intangible, far-reaching aura that extends pretty much over the entire wine world. This aura or stretch of influence, it should be noted, can really only be claimed by Pinot Noir, and this is because it's connected to the fact that Pinot Noir essentially is the genetic godfather, grandfather, ultimate ruler of cultivated wine grapes across the old world, or most of it at least. Because if you look at the European family tree, you'll find Pinot Noir's grubby little genetics everywhere. Chardonnay, Pinot's child. Gamay Noir, Pinot's child. Aligoté, Melon de Bourgogne, Auxerrois Gris, all Pinot children. Incidentally, all of those were conceived when Pinot Noir spent a few passionate evenings with a delightful medieval trollop called Gouet Blanc. But it doesn't end there, because we can also talk about Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc, which are just genetic mutations of Pinot Noir, really conceiving more awesomeness from its own awesomeness. And Pinot Noir's grubby little tendrils even extend so far as to Syrah. And so if you sit with all this, not even mentioning other little genetic tidbits like the fact that Chardonnay and Riesling are half-sisters, one gets the sense that when you drink Pinot Noir, you really are imbibing the authentic, original core genetics of most of the world's most loved cultivars. So perhaps just in that idea and in the intellectual stimulation that comes from thinking about that, Pinot Noir has a sense of grandeur to it that surpasses many of the far, far younger cultivars like Cabernet Sauvignon, for example. But because this is Hand Drink Solo, the wine channel where we review curious wines for curious minds, we will go past mere intellectual musings and get into the glass with today's curious wine, which is the Copper Pot Pinot Noir produced by legendary South African winemaker John Seccombe. John Seccombe really is one of South Africa's most disciplined winemakers, and probably most famous for his range of wines, Thorn and Daughters. But it should be noted that this range is all about white wines, old vine Semillons and Semillon Gris and Sauvignon Blancs, the occasional splash of Chenin. Pinot Noir, however, has never been part of John's day job. In fact, his entire stellar international reputation has focused purely on white wines. So why on earth would a man like John, who has had such success with old vine white cultivars, wade into the territory of making wine from a cultivar that has been nicknamed the heartbreak grape? Well, in a sentence, it's because mother-in-law said please. And if you are a man who's been married for even half an hour and have a vaguely intact frontal cortex, then you'll know that no man makes mother, mommy, dearest-in-law ask twice. Now, the backstory to this backstory is that John Seccombe's wife's parents have a little hotel in South Africa's Drakensberg region called the Cleopatra Mountain Farmhouse. And the Cleopatra Mountain Farmhouse just needed a humble little house red, something that could be poured by the glass, nothing fancy, no great shakes. And in fact, John himself named the wine Copper Pot, a rather humble reference to the humble dented old pots in the hotel kitchen. This was never meant to be a proud, fanciful project. But alas, poor Yorick, or at least poor Wine Spectator, because they didn't get that memo. They were never told that they were not supposed to take this wine seriously. And so when the Copper Pot Pinot Noir 2021 happened to cross their tasting desk, it impressed them so much that it ended up as one of their top 100 wines for that year. The only South African Pinot Noir to feature on that list, which I'm sure you can agree is not bad for a humble hotel kitchen project. Now, from a personal angle, while the 2021 really was fantastic, I think the 2024 is even more exciting. And I'm going to prove that by getting into the glass. But before I do that, I think it's only fair that, having heard all my thoughts on the wine, we let the winemaker himself, John Seccombe, talk about some of his processes in the cellar, a few of the elements and themes that might be exciting him, and what he has to say specifically about the Copper Pot Pinot Noir 2024.
The vine is a weed. You can grow it from the equator to the Arctic Circle. It will grow. It will produce some grapes. If we plant Pinot Noir in Morocco in the desert, we'll certainly be able to get good yields out of it, but you're not going to produce something interesting. There's a reason that there's all these little Goldilocks zones around the world where great wine is produced. And within that, we have these even more precious little zones where we can grow great Pinot Noir. We're very lucky to be in one of these little Goldilocks regions. And I think a lot about why I love Pinot Noir. As winemakers, we often talk about how difficult it is to grow, how it shows where it's grown and where it's made. And I think that is one of the great things about Pinot Noir. And I think it is why it is one of the great grapes of the world. Pinot Noir is also a challenging wine in the cellar. You don't want to overwork it. You don't want to over-extract it. Its color is not always stable. It likes a little bit of oak, but you can easily overdo the oak. It likes a bit of extraction, but those tannins are serious. So you need to manage that in your barrel cellar, in your wine production cellar. So a lot of winemakers see it as this challenge to produce great Pinot Noir. And one of the things I think about quite a lot is this balance between the technical and the artistic in winemaking. Winemaking in some respects can be an incredibly technical, scientific endeavor. And there certainly is a lot of technical and scientific concepts that we need to master in order to make good wine. But how do we move from being technically and scientifically sound to how do we now create these sort of sensitive, artistic expressions of what we're growing on the land? And I think that's definitely the next growth phase as a winemaker. I think if you look at the greatest wines in the world, I think there's a lot of mastery of the technical side of growing, of producing the wine. But there is this sort of artistic looseness in the process. I think you need all that sort of boring technical mastery to be able to go with the flow and be a bit more artistic.
I think we initially pitched the Pinot as kind of entry level, and I've always wanted it to represent very good value to people. So I think price-wise, it's always really punched above its weight. Another cornerstone of the philosophy is to use very good vineyards with very simple vinifications. I've always wanted it to be a bit more serious than the price tag. So I think the entry-level thing is more about the price tag than the style and the intentions there. We still want to offer great Pinot vineyards for not silly money.
So when we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, I guess in a sentence, it tells us very quickly, hi, I'm Pinot Noir. Thanks for noticing, because there are some quite classic elements that pop up. Firstly, red fruit, a kind of pomegranate little bit of cherry, some strawberry, and then alongside that, a touch of spicy cedarwood oak and also mushroom. And those three together really form an unmistakable combination that can only be Pinot Noir. So the cedarwood will obviously come from the fact that this wine does spend 9 months in Burgundian oak, which is to say slightly lighter toasted. And even though it's all old oak, you still get that hint of wood. And then mushroom and red cherry is from the grape itself. That is from the Jekyll and Hyde quality that Pinot can have, because sometimes it's all sweet and floral and perfumey, and other times it's blood and iron and mushrooms. And then in between the fruit, the red cherry and the pomegranate, there's also slightly creamy, almost like strawberry taffy, and a slightly herbal savory element of kind of herbal stem, rocket leaf, a touch of spice to it. And so really, if you to make guesses at the winemaking, those confection strawberry taffy cherry candy comes from the fact that at least half of this wine is made with whole bunches. So you've got whole berries, you've got a little bit of intra-berry fermentation or kind of carbonic fermentation going on in the grape. And then the stems themselves have a little green herbal hint to them. So you can tell a lot just by tasting those candied notes. We know that there was fermentation going on in the berries, and we know that the stems were there. And as the technical sheet says, roughly 40 to 60%, depending on the vintage. Then when we actually get to give it a sip, well, it's almost as if the palate presents itself on the opposite end that the aromas did. We got a bit of spice, bit of mushroom first coming out of the glass on the aromas, but on the palate, you get the beautiful sweet red fruit, bright cherry, strawberry taffy, little bit of that red toffee apple candy coming up front. And then as it flows across your palate, it starts to tighten up and you get the brighter pomegranate, you get sour cherry, and going right at the back, you get the savory note from the herbs, a little bit of that mushroom, and a beautiful spice from the hint of older oak on the wine. So the aromatics can start out serious, a little bit brooding and savory and mushrooms and spice, and then it goes on to the palate, starts out sweet and soft and tightens up. So you've got this really beautiful, arresting, juicy finish. It's kind of like a model for the old expanding, contracting universe thing, but in a glass of wine. And there's a tiny bit of structure as well, but let it be said, this is immediately pleasing. This is drinkable now. The wine does spend a total of 30 days on skins. It's all native ferment, but really that time on skins can be a little bit confusing because sometimes the longer it sits on skins, the more the tannins kind of integrate, as opposed to the longer it sits on skins, the more tannic it gets. That's definitely not a straight line correlation, and I make videos about that at other times. But perhaps what's most important about this wine is who it's for, because I would go so far as to say if you have friends who hate Pinot Noir, and there always will be on both sides of the debate, there are very few people who are just neutral about it. You either love it or you hate it. And this is one of those wines that I think is a great introduction wine because it has some of the surly side and it also has plenty of the pretty sides. It's got a little bit of structure, but not too much. It really is a beautifully accessible way to get to grips with the cultivar of Pinot Noir, which can be a little alienating at times. And then if you want to know more about South African Pinot Noirs that you should reference, I mean, there are 50 lists where you can find Chris Stallam as a producer or Hamilton Russell or Newton Johnson or Storm, but then they're also going to cost $50 to $100. I'd far rather give you the secret Pinot Noir list that winemakers drink when they think no one else is looking that you might find for $20. So here are 4 Pinot Noirs that winemakers drink when they think no one else is looking because they know they're only supposed to drink the really expensive stuff. But this stuff is amazing. Hunt down Oak Valley's Sound of Silence Pinot Noir. Shannon Vineyards, they've got plenty of very fancy premium Pinots, but their Elgin Pinot Noir punches far above its price bracket. Then, coming out of Durbanville, of all places, you've got Maastricht Pinot Noir, a little bit richer, a little bit more tannic, but just a beautiful display of Pinot-specific fruit. And finally, coming out of Stellenbosch, which actually is a little bit of pop trivia, was the region to first bottle Pinot Noir in the entire South African wine history, but has never really been known for Pinot until Dani Carinus, through the winemaking magic of Lucas van Logrenberg, produced the Carinus Stellenbosch Pinot Noir, which I think is outstanding, and you should hunt down the 2024 vintage if you can get hold of it. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but I have left you links to 2 videos, both of which talk about some of those top secret winemaker favorite Pinot Noirs that we just mentioned in the list above. Until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.